Hey, Aron Bernstein again. We're going to keep looking at intervals, the building blocks of music. So by now you want to have a really good handle on letter name spelling, half steps, and accidentals. So be sure you've seen the previous videos in this module. All right, let's hit it. In our previous lesson, we saw how important letter name spelling is in determining what kind of interval we have. So to review, we always include the starting letter in our counting. C up to E is a third. 1, 2, 3 letters. As we'll soon see, it doesn't matter what we do to these notes. It could be C sharp up to E flat, and it would still be called a third. So when you're figuring out what type of interval you have, second, third, fourth, etc., it's all about spelling. In this lesson, we're going to go deeper and figure out interval quality. There are 5 different interval qualities: perfect, major, minor, augmented, and diminished. And we determine these based on how many half steps the interval contains. Just as an example, C up to E is a third, and it spans 4 half steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we call it a major third. But make the E flat, and now it has only 3 half steps. It's still a third because the letter names haven't changed. But now we call it a minor third. Any kind of C up to any kind of E is a third, no matter what accidentals we add. We'll go into more depth in a moment. Okay, something you'll want to commit to memory. The fourth, the fifth, and the octave can be either perfect, augmented, or diminished. That's it. No major or minor for these guys. Then, seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths can be either major, minor, augmented, or diminished. Never perfect. The reason is in the sound. The perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and perfect octave are 3 of the most consonant intervals we have. So we call them perfect consonances. Now, thirds and sixths are also consonant, but not so much as the perfect intervals. So we call these imperfect consonances. And then of course we have the seconds and the sevenths, and they're very dissonant. All right, here's where we really put half steps to use. Let's start with the fourths, fifths, and octaves. Here's a perfect fourth, D up to G. Count all of its half steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 half steps. That's a perfect fourth. Now, if we make this interval a half step larger, D up to G sharp, it's called an augmented fourth, 6 half steps now. Notice how we've kept the original letter name spelling. Go back to the perfect fourth, D up to G, and we could also make it augmented by lowering the bottom note a half step, D flat up to G. Once again, it's a half step bigger now, 6 half steps, and this is also an augmented fourth. Listen to this interval again. You can hear how dissonant the augmented fourth is. We also call it a tritone, or more famously, the devil's interval. All right, back to the perfect fourth, D up to G. If we make a perfect interval a half step smaller, we call it diminished. So D up to G flat is called a diminished fourth. Count the half steps. 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps now. So the diminished fourth is 1 half step smaller than a perfect fourth. And once again, we could also make it a diminished fourth by raising the lower note up a half step. D sharp up to G. Just like before, it's now a half step smaller than our perfect fourth. So, from biggest to smallest, a fourth can be augmented, perfect, or diminished. Now for the fifths. D up to A is a perfect fifth. Count the half steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 half steps. Make the perfect fifth a half step bigger, and we have the augmented fifth, D up to A sharp. It's now 8 half steps. Back to the perfect fifth, and once again we can make it augmented by lowering the bottom note a half step, D flat up to A. 8 half steps again, and this is also an augmented fifth. Return to our perfect fifth, and now make it a half step smaller, D up to A flat. Now it's a diminished fifth. Or back to the perfect fifth, and raise the bottom note a half step, D sharp up to A. This is also a diminished fifth, a half step smaller than a perfect fifth. The diminished fifth has the same number of half steps as the augmented fourth we saw earlier, 6 half steps. And it's also called a tritone. These two intervals sound the same, and we therefore call them enharmonic intervals. We'll come back to those in a short while. And last, the octave. Perfect octaves are easy, D up to D. After the unison, this is our most consonant interval, 12 half steps. A half step bigger, and we have an augmented octave, 13 half steps. Back to the perfect octave, and now make it a half step smaller, 11 half steps, and this is now a diminished octave. So to review, fourths, fifths, and octaves can be perfect, augmented, or diminished. From biggest to smallest, augmented, perfect, diminished. Here's some help. 3 numbers you want to remember, 5, 7, and 12. Perfect fourths are 5 half steps, perfect fifths are 7, and perfect octaves are 12. If you can keep that straight, you'll be in good shape. These intervals will help guide you to all the other intervals later on. Okay, we have 4 more types of intervals to look at: the second, third, sixth, and seventh. Remember, these ones can be major, minor, augmented, or diminished, but not perfect. Let's start on C this time, and we'll go from smallest to largest. Here's a minor second, C up to D flat. It spans just 1 half step, and it's about as dissonant as intervals get. Now, make this minor second a half step bigger, C up to D, and it's now 2 half steps, and we'll call this a major second. Dissonant, but not as much as a minor second. Major seconds are also called whole steps. From here on out, we'll just change the top note and keep the bottom note the same, realizing that we could also do the opposite. So now, make this major second a half step bigger, C up to D sharp, and it's now an augmented second. 1, 2, 3 half steps. We still call it a second because the letter names are unchanged, C up to D sharp. Of course, we could rename that top note E flat, but then, because of the spelling, we'd have to call it a third. Right now, though, we'll spell this interval C up to D sharp, and that makes it an augmented second. This interval will be crucial later on when we look at harmonic minor scales. Okay, you might be thinking, can we have a diminished second? The short answer is yes, but you'll probably never see one. Back to the minor second, C up to D flat. Now, we could lower the top note a half step, and if we're a little masochistic, we could keep the same letter name and call it D double flat. C to D double flat technically is a diminished second, but it's 0 half steps, and there's no reason we can't just call this C up to C, a unison. So a diminished second and a unison are enharmonic intervals. Moving right along, thirds. Here's a minor third, C up to E flat. It spans 1, 2, 3 half steps. Make a minor third a half step bigger, C up to E, and you now have a major third, 4 half steps. These two intervals, major and minor thirds, are crucial because they're the building blocks of chords. So try to remember the minor third, 3 half steps, and the major third, 4 half steps. Now make that major third a half step bigger, C up to E sharp, and there's our augmented third, 5 half steps now. And if we change the spelling of the top note from E sharp to F, we see that a perfect fourth, C up to F, is also 5 half steps. So the perfect fourth and augmented third are also enharmonic, sounding the same but spelled differently. And last, the diminished third. Go back to the minor third, C up to E flat, and make it a half step smaller, C up to E double flat. I know it looks like a major second, 1, 2 half steps, but because of the spelling, C up to E double flat is a diminished third. So these are 2 more enharmonic intervals, the major second and the diminished third. All right, let's go on to the sixth. Earlier in the lesson, I mentioned that the perfect intervals can guide you to others. Here's a perfect fifth, C up to G, 7 half steps. 1 half step bigger, C up to A flat, and we have a minor sixth, 8 half steps. A minor sixth is enharmonic with an augmented fifth. Change the top note from A flat to G sharp, and we now have to call it an augmented fifth. Back to the minor sixth. Make it a half step bigger, C up to A, and it's now a major sixth, 9 half steps. Make it yet another half step bigger, C up to A sharp, and we now call it an augmented sixth, 10 half steps. The augmented sixth will be important later on. There's a whole set of special chords based on this interval, and, big surprise, we call them augmented sixth chords. Last, go back down to the minor sixth, C up to A flat, and we can make it a half step smaller, C up to A double flat, and it's now a diminished sixth. Same number of half steps as a perfect fifth, which is spelled much more kindly, C up to G. Yet another pair of enharmonic intervals. Almost done. Let's do the sevenths. For those, I'd like to start with the octave, C to C, 12 half steps. Because if we just go down 1 half step, C up to B, that gives us a major seventh. 11 half steps and very dissonant, but it's just 1 half step smaller than the octave. Now make this major seventh a half step smaller, C up to B flat, and we have the minor seventh, 10 half steps. Not quite as dissonant as the major seventh. The minor seventh is enharmonic with an augmented sixth, which we'd have if we respelled the top note A sharp. Back to the minor seventh, and if we wanted to live dangerously, we could make it yet another half step smaller, C up to B double flat. This is a diminished seventh, 9 half steps, but you'd more likely see it spelled C up to A, which would be a major sixth. And last, can you have an augmented seventh? Yes, my intrepid ones, but just like the diminished second, you're not likely to find one. Back to the major seventh, 11 half steps, and make it a half step larger. Now it's 12 half steps, but because we're crazy enough to spell it C up to B sharp, we call it an augmented seventh. Of course, good manners would have us respell that B sharp as C, and there's our old pal, the octave. So to wrap this up, if you have a second, third, sixth, or seventh, the interval qualities go from biggest to smallest, augmented, major, minor, and diminished. And try to remember those guide intervals. The perfect fourth, with 5 half steps, will lead you down to the thirds. The perfect fifth, with 7, will lead you up to the sixths. And the octave, with 12 half steps, will lead you down to the sevenths. Still breathing? Congratulations, that's a lot to absorb. Last on our agenda, inversions. In the previous video, Intervals Part 1, we saw how an interval can be flipped over, or inverted. A third, for example, E up to G, will invert into a sixth, E down to G. And interval qualities also invert. Let's see what happens if we take a major interval and flip it over. Here's E up to G sharp, 4 half steps, and that makes it a major third. Now flip it over, E down to G sharp, and it's now a sixth. Count the half steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that's a minor sixth. So major intervals invert into minor ones, and vice versa. What about augmented intervals? Here's an augmented fourth, F up to B, it's 6 half steps. Flip it over, F down to B, and you now have a diminished fifth. So augmented and diminished intervals invert into each other. And last, perfect intervals. Here's a perfect fifth, A flat up to E flat. Flip it and you have A flat down to E flat. This is a perfect fourth. So perfect intervals invert into perfect intervals. That's the gist of it, and it's a pretty big gist. So take your time with the worksheets, and remember, time is the key word. I didn't wake up one day and simply get all this. It really took me a while. So go easy on yourself, and when you've mastered all these intervals, it'll be totally worth it, because you've unlocked pretty much everything else in music theory. I'm Aron Bernstein, and fear no tritones.